Peggy Eaton was born December 3rd, 1799, and throughout her life there were just a few misconceptions about her, starting with her name. In her own words, she never was called Peggy in all my life. I was ordinarily called by my proper name of Margaret. So, Margaret O'Neill was born December 3rd, 1799. Her mom and dad were Rhoda Howell and William O'Neill, who happened to be the owners of an extremely popular Washington, D.C. hotel called the Franklin House, at which all of the most influential men of politics were known to drink, dine, dance, and dorm. So there were 6 of Rhoda and William's kids running around the Franklin House, but Margaret was the most interesting one. She was also the one that was perceived as really exceptionally beautiful, getting male attention from an inappropriately early age. I mean, she once wrote about herself, "While I was still in pantalettes and rolling hoops with other girls, I had the attention of men, young and old, enough to turn a girl's head." So there was some pressure on her. When she was a kid, she also happened to be exceptionally gifted, precocious, and well-educated for the era and her gender. She spoke French and played the piano quite well, which came in handy for entertaining guests of the Franklin House. She had capital O opinions and could debate and compete charmingly with learned men. This led her to be quite a popular character, as you can imagine, among the powerful men of Washington, D.C., far before she'd come anywhere near of age. So then in 1816, when she was 17 years old, she married a purser from the Navy named John Timberlake. The newlywed Timberlakes moved into a house together across the street from the tavern where Margaret grew up and still worked. When Margaret was 18, in 1817, the Timberlakes had their first child, William. Unfortunately, William did not make it, and he passed away in the next year in 1818 when Margaret was 19. And around this time, the Timberlakes met a 28-year-old widower named John Eaton, a senator from Tennessee, at the Franklin House, and they became fast friends. They were close. John Eaton even lent John Timberlake money to pay off his debts, like real fast. They were real nice. So a year after meeting Eaton, the Timberlakes had their second child, Mary Virginia, and then 4 years later, they had their third child, Margaret Rose. And then eventually, good old Senator John Eaton did the couple a favor and got John Timberlake a brand new job, and a much more lucrative job with the Navy, on the USS Constitution. But this required him to go on a 4-year tour of duty, from which he, incidentally, would never return. See, apparently, old John Timberlake had lung problems, and according to the autopsy, ended up tragically dying of pneumonia at sea in 1828. Widow Margaret ended her mourning period, though, a little too soon. So she ended it to marry the kindly Senator Eaton 9 months later, which is 3 months too soon, according to custom, which raised eyebrows and questions like, that was awfully quick, y'all. Because of the hastiness of the marriage, word spread among the hens of Washington, which, the wives of the president's cabinet, that John Timberlake's death was actually a suicide of heartbreak because Margaret Timberlake had actually been having an affair with Senator John Eaton all this time. And John Eaton had only gotten the job for John Timberlake so that he could keep him away from his wife. I mean, but these ladies already didn't like this woman that they called Peggy, because she was the daughter of bar slags who grew up in a tavern from little girlhood, playing to the fancies of powerful men. And those powerful men liked her, as powerful men are wont to do. She grew up holding court, probably out of a need for survival. She had to learn how to make it among men who fancied her, and she did it by being bold. This boldness, though, was unacceptable to the women of Washington, for some reasons. Historian John F. Marsalek explains it better than I can. She did not know her place. She forthrightly spoke about anything that came to her mind, even topics of which women were supposed to be ignorant. She thrust herself into the world in a manner inappropriate for a woman. Except her, and society was in danger of disruption. Except this uncouth, impure, forward, worldly woman, and the wall of virtue and morality would be breached, and society would have no further defenses against the forces of frightening change. Margaret Eaton was not that important in herself. It was what she represented that constituted the threat. Proper women had no choice. They had to prevent her acceptance into society as part of their defense of that society's morality. Margaret's input on the views of Washington wives, on the other hand. I was quite as independent as they, and had more powerful friends. None of them had beauty, accomplishments, or graces in society of any kind, and for these reasons they were jealous of me. So there's that. Either way, none of Margaret's boldness sat well with the ladies of class and Christian decency, although Christ was never one to turn away his fellow man, especially not an underdog. Anyway, Andrew Jackson inducted John Eaton into his cabinet in 1829. Oh, happy day for the Eatons. But not so fast. Why? Because the women of Washington, the other cabinet members' wives, ring-led by dear sweet Floride Calhoun, the wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, fueled by their disdain for ungoverned and ungovernable women, and cloaked in the disapproval of a marriage, commenced a rather tense period of refusal to make social calls to the newlywed Eatons, nor attend parties where the Eatons would be present, which, according to the etiquette of the time, was a major slap in the face and a dark mark upon the couple. The stirring of the cabinet members' wives created a stir in the cabinet, a questioning of the morals of Andrew Jackson's entire administration. But Andrew Jackson, ever the romantic, and not one to let the honor of a lady such as she be tarnished. You see, his wife, his deceased wife, his beloved deceased wife, had had her morality brought to question a few years back, and he believed the pain of that questioning had brought upon her death. So, this was big for him. Plus, also, he had kind of encouraged the whole marriage between the Eatons, and everyone knew it. He had advised John Eaton, if you love the woman, and she will have you, marry her, by all means. So he leapt to Mrs. Eaton and the marriage's defense. At this time, the role of women in the society was thought to function as the standard of moral behavior of the country, the whole country, and Margaret's whole existence went way against the rules. And now the fact that she was to be married to the Secretary of War at Jackson's behest, well, that tore up the cabinet into anti-Eaton and pro-Eaton camps, the fate of the country's morality presumably at stake, culminating in what became known as the Petticoat Affair, or the Eaton Affair of 1831. Although Martin Van Buren called it the Eaton malaria, which I like a lot. So, before the Eaton malaria hit, John C. Calhoun was in line to become the next vice president, or the next president, and he was vice president as it was. But now that Floride Calhoun was on the bandwagon and everything, it just was not looking good for John C. Calhoun. So it was looking real good for Martin Van Buren, who didn't have a wife because he was a widower, and could be pro Margaret Eaton, and that way Jackson could be his buddy. So then it became more of a political issue than a social issue. In fact, there's a historical rumor going around that the entire Petticoat Eaton affair was manufactured by Van Buren, beginning with the rumor of John Timberlake's death being a suicide. Seriously, Van Buren. I don't know if that's true, but anyway, in the end, John Eaton ended up having to resign his position in the cabinet and ended up the governor of Florida. And he did not particularly care for that position in Florida and kind of floundered there and ended up passing away in 1856 in Florida. And his wife was with him the entire time. And she ended up a widow there in 1856. And she remarried a much younger man, and that younger man took her entire fortune, and she ended up dying in a poorhouse in 1879, pretty much penniless. So the incomparable Margaret Peggy O'Neill Timberlake Eaton Buchignani passed away November 8th, 1879. A penniless woman. So she was an interesting and charming woman in her day, but one of whose morals were questionable by the populace. Her legacy is one of political change via great social scandal and much whispering, but only she and the Johns, and maybe Martin Van Buren, knew the truth. Her own words deserve to be heard. I must have said a great many foolish things. I am sure I did very few wise ones. I was foolish, hasty, but not vicious. Just let a little common sense be exercised. While I do not pretend to be a saint, and do not think I was ever very much stocked with sense, and lay no claim to be a model woman in any way, I put it to the candor of the world whether the slanders which have been uttered against me are to be believed.